Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
And today we've seen the Goldfinger. It's been a day of two East Asian movies. This one's subtitled. The first one we saw, The Boy and the Heron, was dubbed. This is live action. I didn't know anything about I picked this because it looked interesting. It had a cool looking poster. I saw it had Tony Leung and Andy Lau, who are two big Hong Kong stars.
Yes.
Who you know at least from Infernal Affairs, if not a few other things. But I didn't know anything about this, and I assumed, I guess, kind of wrongly, because those guys are in their 60s now, that this is going to involve action. It's not an action film at all. It effectively plays out as, I would say, a combination of The Wolf of Wall Street and Goodfellas, in big parts.
I was going to say a combination of The Wolf of Wall Street and The Big Short.
Yeah, there's that going on as well. Yeah. So it's apparently based on the downfall of a real company, Carrion Group, although they're not called that in this, so this is highly fictionalised. It's about a guy played by Tony Leung who we see at the start on a boat to Hong Kong in search of his fortune, like Willy Wonka in the recent film. But instead of magic chocolate, he's got an engineering degree, I think. And as it turns out, the engineering is not that useful to him. What is useful is finding his way into a property deal with someone who thinks he's rather more powerful and rich than he is. He makes money off it, and before you know it, he's built an enormous financial empire. It's mostly based on property, but it has fingers in all sorts of pies, and it is also based heavily on corruption. And we see its uprise and downfall. Andy Lau is the cop, or rather, he's not. Is he a cop? He's the ICAC investigator, right? So, actually, immediately I'm not quite sure, because the film draws a distinction between the police and the ICAC.
That's right.
The international.
They're often at odds with each other. At the beginning of the film, anyway.
What's it stand for? Sorry, the Independent Commission Against Corruption. Yeah, he is the ICAC. So he has arresting powers. We see that because he ends up arresting Tony Leung a lot. But yeah, there is this distinction between the police and the ICAC. The ICAC is a real institution that has apparently, looking it up because I'm not all that familiar with the ins and outs of Hong Kong, has made Hong Kong a very non-corrupt place. But that's not what we're seeing right here. What we're seeing right here is a business that is fundamentally corrupt and people who are fundamentally corrupt. I would say this film is not as good as I think it is. I had a really good time.
Did you?
But I do think it's not as good as the time I had.
That's an interesting way of putting it. I must say, throughout the whole first bit, I thought they're too old. Yeah, I would have liked to have seen younger people in these roles. So on the one hand, they're legends. You've seen them pretty much all your life in this type of cinema and in The Mood for Love and and so on. But really, I think they're too old, to play these roles. So the pleasure of seeing the legendary actors was a bit kind of marred by,
Does it not have a kind of? I suppose another point of reference in American cinema would be Heat. Seeing the two kind of clash against each other, and obviously they are of advancing years to some degree in Heat, although not as old as their 60s as they are here. Would that be a kind of attraction?
I mean, the attraction is that they are legendary actors, so yes, they would have a similar status, I suppose, as Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. But also, unlike Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, they have this legendary co-starring partnership, in the Infernal Affairs films. So, the pleasure is in seeing them again. But the Infernal Affairs films are 30 years ago, right?
20 years, yeah.
I thought they were after that, actually. I thought they were like early 90s.
No, 2000s, early 2000s.
Really?
Infernal Affairs 1, 2002. Infernal Affairs 2 and 3 the following year.
Oh, right, okay. Well, there you go. 20, yeah. I thought it was longer than that, actually. Because, they are stars since the mid-80s. Yeah, so, I mean, it's kind of quite a trajectory. And I just thought they were too old, really. They fit the very end of the film.
because it spans 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, so, by the end of the film, they are the age that the actors actually are at the moment, So I didn't like that. On the other hand, I think and I hated the look of it, by the way. Yeah, so on the one hand, I thought the design seemed great, and you could really tell that there was someone behind the camera who knew about the camera and cinematic space, but it all looked brown and dingy.
So I leant over to you early on and went, "This film looks awesome." This was around the time that we were seeing the riots early on, and there's that scene in the I think it's a police station, and the one guy's got a gun at the other guy, and then another guy comes in with a gun, then everyone else starts pointing guns.
That was great, yeah.
And I was thinking these shots, particularly the close-ups of one character on the right hand of the frame, second character on the left in the background, there's a gun between them. These look like Antoine Fuqua shots, and I always associate his kind of aesthetic with like what cinema should really look like. It should be big and imposing and scary, and that definitely had that. And I think that the film goes on to have moments of set design and moments of lighting that really are showing off and looking fantastic. But I also agree with you that there's an awful lot that is dingy, brown, grey, not as expressive or exciting. I mean, there's a whole section of the film that should be exciting, which is where they're making all the money and spending it all and doing all these corrupt deals and whatever. And it is exciting, but it's not being expressed as much as it could be through the look, I don't think. Although it does have, it did have that shot where they go through that mirrored corridor that goes around a few bends, where it 360s around I think it's the Tony Leung character early on, and that's like such a show-off shot because it's all about going, everything here is mirrored and you're not seeing the cameras. Everything's been painted out so meticulously, it's just showing off. I did like that.
Yeah, no, that is true. On the other hand, I thought this is a film that should have given you the same rush as The Wolf of Wall Street, the sexiness, the sleaziness.
Yes.
And it just doesn't. But I thought even the scene where they go in with the stockbrokers and there are all these women behind cages available to all. I mean, I thought, again, it felt...
Well, that should be the ultimate expression of like the depth of depravity of what this money can bring and what it does to the people, or what it allows the people to express of themselves.
Yes.
That they can just house women in cages. Like, theoretically, you're going to see the antique room, and we've got one antique and 8 caged women.
Yes.
And one of them, it's pointed out, is turned down this one guy previously.
She's a film star.
But she's now been paid to take him off and fuck him. Yeah. So like it should be the ultimate, but it doesn't sell it. It doesn't sell that feeling.
So what I really liked, I suppose, was the investigative dimension. Yeah, that I thought would be confusing or uninteresting, right? Because I know very little about Hong Kong and Hong Kong history, but actually the film lays it out very clearly. Right, like, the Ponzi scheme, how they make their money, what the roles of the various people are. So every time there's a layer of uncovering, there's also a layer of explaining, what's been happening, right? And how these people have been making money out of air, really, right? So I thought that was very interesting. That was very well done, actually.
I slightly disagree on this, because I think... For one thing, it's not clear that it was a Ponzi scheme. I think what we see is a number of different scams, like selling that building and then leaving the guy holding the bag, having promised him someone else would buy it for more, that sort of thing. There are various scams that we see occasionally,
but they're all built on this Ponzi element that by virtue of selling more stock and selling stock at a higher place and then manipulating the stock, you can get something out of it and leave someone else going.
Yeah, so there's always like someone left holding the bag. There's always a greater fool and all that kind of thing. But it's not, it's not the whole business is based on one scam. It's a business that just it's opportunistic. I find that's the way I think it plays out. And I was disappointed that you heard so much, kind of in like kind of throwaway lines every now and again about who are my backers, the Tony Leung character, who are his backers, and he never says anything. And I thought the revelation would ultimately be there are no backers, and this was pure Ponzi. Like, it was absolutely out of thin air. I had nothing ever and was convincing people to buy in. But then there's this thing much later on about, my backers are the most powerful of the most powerful. I can't even sniff their shadows. These are people that run countries. And I'm like, okay, so here we go into the real revelation. And then it forgets about it immediately, and we don't hear anything more. I wanted to know what it all came down to.
I don't think anything more could be said, and I think that was enough. Though on the other hand, I thought it could also have been conveyed more powerfully, because the stark message there is that the world is entirely corrupt, internationally, that it's not just Hong Kong, this is happening all over, kind of, in the West, in the East, that kind of, in order to maintain that level of corruption, people become disposable, the police and the courts are for sale and have been sold, etc., etc. Right?
Yeah, no, I get that. I do think it was suggesting more than it comes in at this moment. Actually, these people are real and they are that big, and then it went nowhere with it. I thought it was kind of pulling its punch there or something. I also felt that it got a little bogged down in financial detail. We get kind of, it's not going into like huge explanations like it does in The Big Short, for instance. It's not explaining this is how this works and this works and this works. But you get these conversations, you get the scenes in the stock market where they're talking in relatively specific terms about, I bought this for this much and I sold it for that much and here's this and here's that, and money becomes it becomes quite dense with numbers effectively. And I thought that it reminded me of, I'm sure there's a bit in The Wolf of Wall Street where DiCaprio's character addresses the audience directly and says, he starts to explain something about the financial dealings and then goes, fuck it, you don't want to hear about that, it's pointless, we're just making shitloads of money. And I kind of thought this one needed a little of that attitude. All they were doing was making shitloads of money, and the details are, I think, a little bit of a distraction.
I don't know. I enjoyed that. I felt I needed it. I was certainly never bored by the film. I also never felt really lost in it. So I think kind of whatever it was doing narratively worked for me, right? What I suppose it wasn't doing enough was, and in spite of what you're saying, kind of visually, and tonally, like, what is driving these people? Desire for, I don't know, sex, wealth.
This is where I think the film is at its most simple, because you've got this clash of these two characters ultimately, even though I think, and in star terms, they are kind of equal parts, but in character terms, they're really not. I think the cop, or rather the ICAC investigator, is effectively a secondary character. We really have one central protagonist, and that's Tony Leung's character.
Though paradoxically, the cop is the one who's given an interior life and a family life. You actually know very little about
Tony Leung.
About Tony Leung, except that he's charismatic and a scammer. But you don't know anything else. You have no sense of where he's coming from, why he's doing this, why. This is
absolutely it. Like you get, effectively, it just comes down to, I guess he's just the apogee of all greed, and that's what he represents and what he is about. And the Andy Lau character is all about just justice and process and getting it right. And again, we're like, what really, why does he hate these? Does he hate these people? Does he hate the system that allows it? We don't hear anything of that. We get his family life and how doing this job disrupts his family life and is a danger to it, but we don't get, why is it worth that disruption, that danger?
It's a film that to me feels also very anti-British, and I wondered if you had any views on it.
Well, I would say no, I don't have any views on it, but essentially because, my understanding of the history of Hong Kong and the British kind of ownership of it is very limited. I remember when Hong Kong was given back to the Chinese in 1997, which means I would have been 8 years old.
Which is pretty much when the film ends.
I did kind of think, we must see some British people in this at some point, right? It's because it's all Chinese people. And then, some British people do show up, and the first scene that we see any of them in is that one at the party where they're talking about buying that building, and the guy on stage gives a fuck you to the Chinese. And then everyone, including all the Chinese characters, with the exception of Tony Leung, puts their hand on their chest and sings Rule Britannia. And I thought, how realistic is it? It seemed like such a parody. I've never seen that, but maybe in 1970s.
That kind of would make sense to me in a way. The reason why I think it's anti-British is the first British person you see, it's so awfully acted. The actor is so badly chosen. The accent is so terrible, right? And of course, they're a sleazy person. And I think every single British person that you see is a corrupt banker who's willing to sell, themselves for whatever kind of profit they can get. And I mean,
maybe it's the privilege that of being British, and I don't know about any of these people. I'm the centre of empire. That like it doesn't bother me how I'm portrayed.
Yeah.
Maybe that's it.
Well, I just thought that it's interesting because if the film really ends at the moment that China takes over, which it's been the last 25 years or so, and that's when the film ends. Then the assumption is that corruption kind of ends at that point, right? And that the villains really kind of were the British who kind of.
But do you think it's the film's implication? What do you think that is the film's implication? I mean, as you say, I think you're right to say that the British, who we do see, are as corrupt as anyone else and involved in these deals, but also the Chinese that we see are also on their own terms, just acting in corrupt ways, and
Listen, I think if we saw a British film in which all the Chinese people depicted were, corrupt idiots, on the take, there would be an issue. And I just think, because also in this film, you see, the Russians are no better, but you see them very little, right? So this is the only major ethnic group that is depicted is Brits, and they're all really sleazy, corrupt, opportunistic. I mean, I think the film has a view on it.
Yeah.
No.
Now,
whether it's warranted or not warranted.
Agree with that view.
Well, you could agree with that view, but I just think it's there.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that it's there. I also thought, so interesting that the film begins with all of these demonstrations against police corruption. And what we've seen in Hong Kong recently is those demonstrations are no longer allowed.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, the end of this, in what I find a very kind of unconvincing coda, Tony Leung's character is convinced to give himself up and does, and in a very kind of brief final scene, he pleads guilty, he gets put away.
For 3 years.
For 3 years.
After, 55 murders have taken place as a result of his actions.
A 10-year investigation.
Yeah.
And the cop and his wife get to go off and resume their happy life together, having put away the criminal. And it's like, and actually, again, you go back to The Wolf of Wall Street, and the thing was at the end of that, he ended up being put away and doing time. But the twist was that time was incredibly easy. He's still fucking super rich, and the system is still built for him. But that's not what this is saying. This is saying, no, they won in the end. Justice was served. And it really felt like, I mean, maybe it's the truth of the story to some degree that it's based upon, the real story. But it did feel like all of those old kind of Hays Code endings where it's like they have to be put away in the end, and you have to, morality has to ensue. And,
It's interesting because, I didn't know anything about it at all. I mean, I just went because it's rare that a Chinese film, gets distributed really nice. So I welcome the opportunity. I just want to see it blind. I was very happy to see the stars, right? Because I love them and I've been seeing their work for like half my life. And it's just interesting to see the team up at this particular age, and I thought they were both very good and very charismatic, and they were a pleasure to see. Though I do think they were too old. Yeah.
Do you think the structure worked of setting the film for the most part in those interrogation scenes with everyone having been arrested, and then a lot of the story being told in flashback?
Yes, I did. Yeah. I think it works narratively. You're not bored. The perspective keeps shifting, right? So you do go from character to character to character, and then the film has its own perspective, on what took place. And I think the tensions between all of those things, I mean, I wasn't bored once. I was a little bit decrying the look of the film. And again, I hesitate to criticize it very much because, now when I go to Cineworld, I just think, is it the fucking projection system? Because really, there is such a difference in luminosity between the IMAX screen and the non-IMAX screen.
And this was not on an IMAX.
And it was not an IMAX. And, kind of even I was seeing, I saw Saltburn there. And then I saw Saltburn on Prime. And the colors are more vivid on my television than, So it's just the same thing. Could it be that the film had this very vibrant, brown palette, and all you're seeing now in this lousy projection system is just a dingy brown palette? So I'm not sure, but I did feel that the film lacked kind of visual vibrancy. Right?
Yeah. I know what you mean.
But I like you say, I have all these problems with it, and still I enjoyed it very much.
I had a terrific time throughout. I think there maybe were 1 or 2 points when it started to lag, and in fact, it felt very long, although it is just 2 hours. But I mean, I was starting to feel like, haven't we had 2 hours at this point? There were points where it started to feel very long, and I don't know what it is. Maybe on a always on a second viewing it'll feel shorter because films always do. But there was definitely an area of the film which is around the time that they're making continual scam deals and making money hand over fist and so on, where I couldn't work out what the narrative drive was at this point. They just kept doing sort of the same thing over and over again a few times, and I thought, when is the twist going to come? When is the next bit? And I think that was a little bit of a lag. Maybe there was an element or two of the film's narrative that could have been tighter in that respect. But for the most part, I was really enjoying it. I liked, it did have flair, it did have flourishes. It had that thing with all the money being thrown all over the table, and the thing with the women in the cages that could have been shown off better, but still is expressive of it was a certain kind of masculine. I don't know what the word is, toxicity or what have you that this brings out. I mean, it's a very masculine film. There's one woman involved in this scam. So I don't know. Like I had a really good time, and I do think it looks good on a big screen. I enjoyed seeing it there. I think some of those compositions I really enjoyed.
Yes, I did.
Character on one side of the screen, character on the other, talking at each other, like really thought through composition.
Yeah, there was one shot where it had like, you saw people at 2 corners, and then I think it was Andy Lau kind of walking right through. And you just think, oh my God, this is terrific. Someone who really knows how to use space.
Yeah, so it's like really thought through composition and shot selection that has an eye on visual impact. Even if we do have our reservations about how much that visual impact is brought out through other things, through colour and brightness, essentially. But I had a really good time, and like I said, I think it is ultimately too simple. It has this pat ending that I don't really buy. That it certainly is played too easily. It's not built up to enough.
I must say, if people are going because they want a rematch of Infernal Affairs, they'll be disappointed, I think. Because the Infernal Affairs films just had a tension, kind of that this film doesn't have. I think the plot is ingenious, and the characterization is so pleasurable to watch. But that kind, the combination of action sequences and narrative tension, suspense. Right, where in the Infernal Affairs films that you're sometimes just gasping at kind of what could happen. This is not in this film.
No.
Right. So in that sense, if people are going for something similar to that, they'll be disappointed.
Yeah. But if you're not, and as long as you also don't expect kung fu foolishly, then you'll probably have a pretty good time. I did.
Yes, I did as well. All right. Well, on that note, we recommend it. We had fun. We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, Audible, Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter at Eavesdrop Movies, and Blue Sky, eavesdropping.bsky.social, and the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.